I've spent decades studying the minds of those who've crossed that invisible line, when pain becomes violence, when trauma turns into tragedy. But there are a few faces I can't forget, and Aileen's is one of them. Not because of what she did, but because of what I saw in her eyes. Even after the killings. 7 men. That's how many lives she took, one by one, all shot at point-blank range, some left on highways, some stripped of identity. Most dismissed by the media as John's just another trick gone wrong. But behind the headlines, behind the mugshot that screamed rage and madness, there was a silence. A silence that stretched back decades. Aileen Wuornos, once a child, then a drifter, then a prostitute, ultimately became known as America's first female serial killer. And yet, she didn't kill for the thrill. She said it was self-defense, that they tried to rape her, that it was them or her. But the law didn't believe her, the public didn't care, and by the time she sat strapped to the execution table in 2002, nobody was listening anymore. But I was. Because what drove her to kill wasn't just the men she met, it was the world she never belonged to. This isn't a tale of monsters, it's a story of absence, of what happens when no one shows up, no one holds you, no one believes you. So let's go back, before the mugshot, before the gun, back to when she was just a little girl, clutching a worn-out teddy bear waiting for someone who never came. I've often said the most violent people I've studied didn't start with violence. They started with silence, with loneliness, with cold. Aileen was born in 1956 in Rochester, Michigan. Her father, already gone serving time for child molestation, later found hanging in his prison cell. Her mother, barely 20, abandoned the family when Aileen was just a baby. By the time she was 4, she was already living with her grandparents. But living doesn't quite describe it. She survived there.
Her grandfather was a strict, sometimes cruel man. Her grandmother, rumored to be an alcoholic, offered little warmth. No one ever told Aileen she was loved. No one ever said, "You matter."
So she looked for love elsewhere.
At age 9, she was already trading sexual favors for food, cigarettes, even for warmth on cold nights. By 11, she was pregnant. The father, still unknown. The result: she was sent away to a home for unwed mothers, gave birth, and never saw the child again. She was a child grieving the loss of her childhood while nobody noticed.
I've sat across from dozens of killers, and I always ask, when did you first feel like the world gave up on you? If I'd asked Aileen, I don't think she'd have had a specific moment. I think she'd say, I was born into the giving up.
The teddy bear I mentioned before, she probably never had one. But if she did, I imagine it was missing an eye, torn, used, discarded, just like she was.
And that's where it starts. Not with hate, but with being invisible. When I look back at her childhood, I don't see a monster forming. I see a girl screaming, and no one answering. We often think of school as a place of learning, of structure, of safety. But for Aileen, it was another stage, where she rehearsed her disappearance. By the time she stepped into elementary school, she was already marked. Poor, dirty. Rumors of what she did behind the trees at recess. She wasn't a student, she was a spectacle. And children, they can be crueler than any courtroom. The teachers didn't intervene. They didn't ask why a child reeked of cigarette smoke at 9. They didn't ask why she was so angry, why her drawings were filled with knives and fire. They dismissed her like an overdue assignment. She became what they whispered troubled. That word again, troubled. It blames the storm, not the weather, that made it. She fought often, cursed loud, skipped class, and when she did show up, her eyes were always scanning, never trusting. I've seen those eyes in prisons, eyes that say, "Don't touch me, don't pity me, I already know you hate me." But perhaps the most heartbreaking detail, she still craved connection. She wanted friends. Sometimes she gave away what little she had just to sit closer to someone at lunch, just to matter. But shame clings like smoke, and no one wanted to be near the girl who had done things. She wasn't falling through the cracks, she was being pushed. Every hallway, every locker slam, every ignored hand raised, it carved something deeper into her, a belief that would never leave her. I am not one of you. She didn't stop going to school, she stopped being in school. Her body showed up. Her mind left long before. I've always believed puberty is the most dangerous bridge for children like Aileen, because when your body begins to change but your soul is still bruised, you don't cross that bridge, you fall from it.
Aileen's teenage years weren't marked by growth. They were marked by transactions. Her body became a currency, not because she was promiscuous, but because she was starving.
Starving for food, starving for heat, starving for love.
By 13, she was no longer a child in trouble. She was that girl, the one behind the gas station, the one the boys bragged about and the adults judged.
But no one stopped her. No one said, "This isn't who you are." Instead, they whispered, "See what she's becoming." And that's the thing about shame. When it's projected onto you long enough, you start to wear it like skin. I believe that's when the deviation began. Not in her thoughts, but in her reflection. She didn't see herself as human anymore. She saw herself as used, replaceable, already ruined.
And there's something quietly tragic in that.
Because deep inside, she still hoped. She still wanted someone to look at her, not with disgust, but with concern. To say, "I see you, and I don't want anything from you." But those eyes never came, only stares, only hands, only deals. I've often said that the moment a person stops believing they deserve care, that's when they begin to walk the loneliest road. Aileen walked it barefoot, through frostbitten winters, and still no one followed. The teddy bear, if it still existed, was probably buried by then, because there's no room for innocence where survival becomes instinct. By the time Aileen entered her 20s, she had mastered something that society often rewards until it turns deadly: the mask. To strangers, she was wild, tough, unapologetic. The kind of woman who could drink anyone under the table, hitchhike across states, sleep in a car, and still wake up with a cigarette and a smirk.
But underneath was a girl whose world had taught her, if they don't see your pain, they can't hurt it.
That mask, her anger, her bravado, her crude jokes, it wasn't just protection, it was camouflage. When you've been abused, discarded, and used so many times, you stop looking for help. Instead, you become hard. Hard enough so no one tries to touch the soft, broken places inside. She lived from motel to motel, worked the highways, sold her body like it was the only tool she had left. And in many ways, it was. But people didn't see a woman in pain. They saw a criminal, a drifter, a crazy prostitute.
And I ask, why didn't anyone notice?
Not the police who arrested her for assault. Not the clerks who watched her argue for spare change. Not the lovers who came and went, often using her, sometimes hitting her. No one looked behind the mask.
Because it was easier that way.
When society sees you as a problem, they stop wondering if you were once a person. She screamed at the world, and the world muted her. And in that silence, something else began to grow. Not just pain, but rage. And rage, when it festers long enough, doesn't just burn the person holding it. It waits. It waits for the moment when the mask cracks and the world finally does pay attention. But by then it's too late. Everyone has a breaking point. But for people like Aileen, that point isn't a sudden explosion. It's a quiet, slow collapse, years in the making. And then something tips it over. For Aileen, that something was betrayal. The final betrayal.
In the late 80s, she met a woman named Tyria, someone she loved, maybe the only person she'd ever truly loved. They lived together, struggled together, survived together.
For a while, Aileen believed she had something real. A home, even if it was a rundown room. A partner, even if they argued. But love to her always carried a cost. And when money ran out, when rejection came again, that mask she had worn for so long started to crumble. In 1989, she claimed it was self-defense. A man picked her up, took her to a remote spot. She said he raped her. She said she shot him to stay alive. The truth we may never fully know. But what I do know as a psychologist is that the act itself, pulling the trigger, wasn't born that night. It was born in every insult, every bruise, every time someone used her body like a roadside convenience. It was born in the silence that swallowed her pain. And in that moment, with her finger on the trigger, I believe she didn't just see him. She saw them all. The men who laughed. The boys who took. The adults who looked away. One shot, then another, and suddenly everything she had been hiding was out. It wasn't just revenge, it was release, a twisted form of justice that no court would recognize.
But in her mind, for the first time, she wasn't the victim. She was the one in control.
I've sat across from killers who cried, and I've sat across from those who didn't blink. But Aileen, she was different. She carried her crimes like open wounds, never fully healing, never fully hiding. Between 1989 and 1990, she killed 6 more men. All shot, all found near Florida highways. Each case had similarities: pickup scenes, body disposals, missing wallets. The pattern was unmistakable.
Was it calculated, maybe? But in my view, it wasn't about method, it was about memory. Each encounter seemed to trigger something buried deep inside her.
When I listen to her recorded confessions, I don't hear cold detachment. I hear waves of emotion crashing: rage, fear, relief, even sorrow. She claimed the men tried to rape her. All of them. Self-defense, she insisted. Every time. And maybe that's how she justified it to herself. Because the truth is, when someone has been victimized repeatedly, the line between fear and fury blurs. In those moments with her finger on the trigger, she wasn't just defending her body. She was defending a lifetime. I imagine it felt like power for the first time she decided who got to walk away. But it also took something from her. After each killing, she didn't grow stronger. She unraveled. Faster, looser, more volatile. There's a look I've seen in offenders like her. A look that says, I can't come back. She wore that look long before she was caught. Each time she pulled the trigger, it wasn't just another man dying. It was another part of her that went with him. The teddy bear, if we return to that symbol, was no longer buried. It was burned. After the killings, some serial offenders grow colder, sharper. They refine their rituals, sharpen their lies. But Aileen, she unraveled. She didn't hide. She didn't build a double life. She drank more, fought more, yelled at strangers in bars, dared police to stop her. It was as if she wanted to be caught or punished or seen. There was no mask anymore, just raw nerve and erratic anger. She shoplifted, got into fights, slept with one hand gripping a pistol under her shirt. People say she was crazy, that she lost it, but I don't believe that. I believe she was collapsing under the weight of every moment she had carried alone since childhood. No support, no guidance, just the echo of a voice in her head that whispered, "It's always you against them." Even her relationship with Tyria began to crack. Aileen could feel her slipping away, and nothing terrifies a wounded soul more than losing the one hand that held them. She told different stories to different people. She was raped. She wasn't raped. It was survival. It was revenge. But all the versions had one thing in common. She was always alone in them. I've read her letters, watched hours of her interviews, and what strikes me is not the horror of the crimes, it's the grief in her voice when she talks about being unwanted. There was no thrill, no joy, just damage piling up like snow no one bothered to shovel. Aileen didn't stop killing because she felt guilty. She stopped because she was empty. Even rage burns out eventually. And all that was left was the cold. When they finally arrested Aileen in January of 1991, she wasn't hiding in some remote cabin or elaborate underground den. She was at a biker bar, drunk, alone, tired. The arrest didn't come with screams or resistance. She almost looked relieved, like someone who'd been waiting for it.
But the real story isn't in the handcuffs. It's in what came next.
The police found the evidence: guns, fingerprints, stolen items. They tracked down Tyria, the woman she loved, and made a deal.
Tyria would help get a confession. She agreed. They put her in a motel, wired the phones. Aileen called, and over the next few days, she spoke to Tyria again and again, never knowing it was all being recorded. I've listened to those tapes. And there's a moment, quiet, almost soft, where Aileen says, "I just want to make sure you're okay." Even after all she'd done, she wasn't thinking about herself. She was trying to protect the only person she ever clung to. When she finally confessed to the murders, she did it to shield Tyria from being dragged into it. "I did it alone," she said. again and again. That's the part people miss. Underneath the rage, the brokenness, the fury was a woman still desperate for love.
During the trial, she lashed out, yelled at reporters, spoke with venom. But it wasn't madness. It was the final layer of armor.
Because when the world calls you a monster, eventually you snarl back. But if you looked closely, really closely, you'd see it in her eyes. Not evil.
Just someone who hadn't been looked at with kindness in a very, very long time.
When I think about Aileen Wuornos now decades after her execution, I don't see a headline. I see a warning. A child abandoned, a teenager abused, a woman ignored until she exploded. The justice system called her a predator. The media called her a monster. But what if we had called her something else? Before the gun, before the blood. What if someone had called her human? You see, people often ask me, could we have stopped her? And the answer is yes, but not at the end. Not when the bodies were found, not at trial, not on death row. We had to stop her at 9 years old, when she was sleeping in the woods, trading her body for a hamburger, crying with frostbite on her fingers, and no one coming to find her. That's when the intervention should have come. But no one came. And when no one comes for long enough, the human heart folds inward, and sometimes it hardens into something it was never meant to be. I'm not here to excuse what she did. 7 men died, their families grieve. That pain is real, but Aileen's story asks us a harder question. What does a society create when it turns away from the broken? Because monsters aren't born in shadows, they're born in plain sight and ignored one day at a time. In the end, she was executed by lethal injection. October 9th, 2002, she looked into the glass and said her final words, "I'll be back, like Independence Day, with Jesus." And as strange as that sounds, I think she meant it, because in her mind she was always waiting for someone to save her.
Maybe now we can start saving others before it's too late.